Words matter. We need to ditch the outdated and patronising narrative about aid. Welcome to Development Unspun. When I left school at the age of 18, really no one had taught me anything about my country's history, Britain's history of empire, racism and subjugation. William Wilberforce was a name that I knew naturally, but I knew nothing about the hundreds of years of slaving before him and very little about the long period of time of empire that followed. Faced with people claiming colonialism was ancient history, this was like, I guess, the early 90s. I used to ask people when they thought the last African colony of the UK gained independence. No one knew. People would guess the 1960s. Actually, it was 1980, Zimbabwe, little more than a decade previously. I learned pretty much all I know about empire and racism from listening to reggae. I still remember the first mixtape that my brother made me when I was about 13. And reading Martin Luther King and stuff like that. At university, I did begin to educate myself more formally, but I didn't have to, and I think many people didn't. So white Britons need re-educating. We know next to nothing about the history of colonialism and the impact it is still having in the world today. And even people in the sector that I work in, the international development sector, I would say their history is also pretty iffy. In most of my 20 years in the aid sector, I can remember, until maybe a few years ago, a handful of conversations about racism and colonialism. Last year in 2020, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement has changed that, and I think hopefully forever. If you are British working in international cooperation and development, you have to make an active, conscious effort to see things from a different perspective, from a southern perspective. Trying to understand international development without analysing colonialism and racism is like trying to understand Pompeii without noticing Vesuvius. People from countries that have been colonised understand profoundly how that has impacted their countries and their communities, their daily reality, how decisions made decades ago continue to impact their lives. Too many people in the aid sector have never got to know the reality of the global south, deeply observed people's lives. I will never forget a senior colleague I was working with at an INGO describing people who had literally fought in liberation struggles in their country, describing them as crazies, because their analysis of what was required was significantly more radical than his own. What utter arrogance, a total failure to listen. We cannot make meaningful change in the world without confronting ourselves and our roles in perpetuating the power dynamics in the international development sector. And because that's hard, we tend to try and avoid the intellectual and emotional showdown for as long as possible. We prefer to persuade ourselves that the context isn't right to get radical. The context will never be right. That our country isn't ready to hear this. Our country will never be ready. That our organisation has more pressing, urgent priorities. It always will. But the time for tiptoeing around racism is over. It's time to turn the tables, to centre Southern perspectives. And we can start by ending once and for all the patronising, embarrassing, post-colonial, neo-colonial, self-aggrandising, self-serving, white saviour complex, 20th century, 19th century, unconvincing, delusional half-truth of overseas aid. I've just published a book called The Future of Aid. I could have called it The End of Aid, probably should have done. The commonly used language of aid is outdated. It's a continued miseducation of the public in quotes, donor countries and in recipient countries. A new vision for what we're calling global public investment is required, accompanied by a new narrative for today's reality. Spending on our global common welfare is not a question of charity that can be cut when things get tight at home, as many politicians would have us believe, and indeed as many NGOs continue to perpetuate. It's a question of sensible spending, necessary investment in mutually beneficial objectives. Just like public spending at the national level, in fact, which we don't describe as largesse or aid or charity. It's redistributive, it's public spirited. The book has drawn on discussions with people all over the world for many years, and people in the global south always prioritise narrative. They see it as fundamental to the changes that we need. The idea of being treated as an equal, sat at the same table to discuss what policies are required and what finances are required, rather than as kind of, the recipient of largesse, faux largesse. That attitude is liberational. It's about dignity. Words matter. They can convey respect or condensation. They can convey respect or condescension. And too often in the world of aid, it is the latter. But in the global north, there's reluctance to accept that. We're invested in the language of generosity. And we're so ignorant of our past that when someone says a word like reparations, you hear people say things like, oh, well, I wasn't personally involved 100 years ago. And that gets tossed into the unrealistic, too radical box. But as southern countries grow in power, they are demanding more respect. They're demanding less patronising language to accompany the shifting sands of global politics. So let's end this talk of aid, but let's keep large-scale redistribution in our world and investment in global common objectives. How can we square that circle? Well, that's what our concept of global public investment seeks to do.